Gen 9 is 3 years old. Or maybe it has been for a few weeks. Look, I don't know when this video is coming out. It's hard to believe that these systems are already a fifth of the way to being able to take driver's ed, especially since most of us didn't get our systems until at least a year after launch. But hey, 3 years is enough time for prices to have come down, allowances to have been saved, and games to have been released, so most people who needed one of these consoles have had the chance to purchase one and play something they've been anticipating. I'm certainly the same way, and after almost 2.5 years with my PS5, allow me to be the first to say, something feels off. I've had this feeling building in my gut for the past couple months, and I'm 99% sure it's not a kidney stone. I feel like something is missing from these consoles, something that, as far as I can tell, most other consoles have by this point in their life cycle. And it was only by reviewing the lives of these consoles thus far that I think I've figured out what that something is. I'm not saying you have to agree with me, but let's quickly recap the generation so far and see if you notice it too. Keep in mind that I haven't had the chance to play a lot of the games I'm about to mention. I'll comment when I can, but these are just my opinions and perceptions on how these games were received, so I suppose I'll allow you to take them with a grain of salt. The PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X launched in November of 2020, and the world took notice. I mean, what else was there to do in 2020 other than be depressed, wait for the PS5 to come out, realize you couldn't afford a PS5, and then be depressed again? Price gouging is the name of the game, and while the practice has been around for a while, I don't think I ever recall it being as bad as long as it was for this generation. Even a year after release, these things were consistently being sold for well over $700 on StockX. That's just how tricky it was to get your hands on them. There were several factors contributing to the craze, but the biggest was likely the lack of production caused by some pandemic that was going on at the time. I don't know, like cholera or something. Whatever the case, it kept the prices exorbitantly high for months after release, and although production has more or less met demand in the last year or so, these prices are what I associate most strongly with the first few years of these consoles' lives. For the few who did manage to get their hands on a new console at launch, there were some games to play. The big third-party releases at launch were Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Valhalla and Watch Dogs Legion. Yeah, that looks about right. Call of Duty, Dirt 5, Bugsnax, and Yakuza Like a Dragon were also available at or near launch, and of these, Yakuza was really the only one that got consistently good review scores. Everything else warrants little more than a yawn. On the more exclusive side of things, the PlayStation 5 also launched with Godfall, Sackboy, Demon's Souls, and Spider-Man Miles Morales. I've dabbled a bit in Demon's Souls, and it seems like a solid enough remaster, but of all these launch titles, Spider-Man was definitely the one I was most looking forward to, and man, what a disappointment. Shorter, buggier, more poorly written, and with a recycled map to boot, it was definitely a step backward when compared to its predecessor. Few games deserve to be called $70 DLC more than this. So, not the greatest launch for these new consoles, but at least there were games to play, and variety at that. Beyond that first week, though, little of note released in the remainder of 2020, unless you count janky Breath of the Wild clones as things of note. 2021 also had a slow start as far as game releases are concerned. Hitman 3 seemed like a solid way to cap off the Hitman trilogy, and Destruction All-Stars was just as underwhelming as everyone expected it to be. Things did pick up a bit more in March, though, with ports of Control, Crash 4, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and the release of It Takes Two. This was the surprise hit of the year, a super charming looking co-op adventure game developed by Hazelight, the same guys behind A Way Out. I haven't played it yet, but I'm sure I could convince at least one of the boys to give it a try with me. It looks like a lovely time, and a great way to distract everyone from this disaster class releasing on the same day. April was another slow month with some mixed bag releases. Outriders, Warframe, and Oddworld Soulstorm were some of the bigger names, but overall weren't anything crazy. Genshin Impact also released and has a massive following, but I'll die before I call a gacha-infested mobile game good. May was big solely for the release of Resident Evil Village and the internet's favorite Dami Mommy Vampire Lady. Holy shit, those words really just came out of my mouth. It was one of the main Game of the Year contenders, and its reviews put it nearly on par with Resi 7. It's not really my thing because that, but I will give credit where credit is due. If you're looking for a good survival horror game, it's probably hard to go wrong with either of these titles. June saw the release of quite a few more ports and remasters, most of which are fine enough, as well as Death's Door and the PS5's first fully exclusive title, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. This is one of the first titles I played on my new system, and I had a blast. The 2016 game was good, but this felt like a step up in nearly every way. I think my biggest problem with it is that despite being very visually and technically impressive, there's not much about this game that feels like it just couldn't have been done on PS4. A great title, no doubt, though I'm not entirely sure it's the system seller that it was marketed as. And 1 month later, we got the Xbox Series X's first fully exclusive game, Microsoft Flight Simulator. And that's all I have to say about that. Psychonauts 2 was the big title for August, and I think I'd consider it my overall game of the year for 2021. Microsoft basically handed Double Fine a blank check and told them to take whatever time they needed for this game, and it shows. Psychonauts 2 is polished to an insane degree. It excels at everything that the first game did well, and improves upon all of its shortcomings. It's slightly better than Aliens Fireteam Elite. Lastly, we have Deathloop, released in September as a timed exclusive for PS5, and it's a pretty fun puzzle shooter? I don't know. It's far from perfect, it's still got that Bethesda funk to it, but regardless, I'd consider it a decent addition to your library. And that was most of the major releases for year one. There were some solid indie releases in those last few months, most notably Kena Bridge of Spirits, as well as a few more ports and remasters, and a pretty mixed reception to the few remaining AAA releases. Overall, an okay first year with a few solid releases, but nothing too wild. Year 2 started off with a bang. Call of Duty Vanguard. It wasn't good. Okay, never mind that, because 1 week later we got Grand Theft Auto The Trilogy. Shit. Hey, no worries, because another week later we got Battlefield 2042. Okay, what the fuck? Yeah, 2021 didn't really end on a high note as far as third-party releases are concerned. Pretty much anything of note released to either mixed or negative reception, owing to the fact that a lot of these games debuted in buggy or outright incomplete states. It was, however, a big time for Xbox, as we finally got some Series X exclusives with mass appeal, starting with Forza Horizon 5. This was my initial game of the year, and I had a blast playing through it for a good month or so. Ultimately, though, I didn't get into this one as much as other entries in the series. I didn't find the world quite as addictive to explore, and the dialogue with its forced Spanglish got old really quickly. I still think it's a solid time, though with the benefit of hindsight, I can say it's one of the weaker entries in its series. 1 month later, Xbox fans finally got the game they'd all been waiting for, Halo Infinite. The long-awaited 6th main entry in the series, Infinite was truly the next evolution of the Halo franchise. If you enjoy half-baked Halo. Okay, to be fair, Halo Infinite brings a lot to the table. A grappling hook, an open world, a grappling hook, explosive barrels, a grappling hook. Guys, it has a grappling hook. However, a lot of these ideas feel only partially implemented, or like they're at odds with one another. The world and its missions are repetitive, and the story is pretty lackluster. Halo Infinite has some great ideas and probably the best combat the series has ever seen, but let's be honest, it could have used some more time in the oven. At least the multiplayer is pretty solid, and it's free to boot, which, hey, that's probably the main reason you'd want to get Halo anyways. Like the year prior, 2022 had a slow start for game releases, at least in January. Early February had a few solid titles, Sifu, Ollie Ollie World, Dying Light 2, and Horizon Forbidden West. However, nothing was anticipated more highly than the release of Elden Ring, an open-world Souls game. I'm not even a big Dark Souls fan, and even I was intrigued. Elden Ring is phenomenal. It's the challenging, heavy-handed combat that you know and love / hate placed in a massive world with limitless attention to detail. There's so many things to discover, so many incredible boss fights, secret areas within secret areas. This is it. The reason to buy a next-gen console. It was released on last-gen consoles, damn it. Things definitely slowed down for the next couple of months. We got Gran Turismo 7, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, Stranger of Paradise, and Sniper Elite 5, all of which received plenty of praise and criticism alike. LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga was a big nostalgia trip for many, and it seemed to be a solid return to form to the LEGO Star Wars series. Of course, plenty of ports and remakes. I swear, Rockstar will still be selling new copies of GTA 5 well into my retirement. Even when spring turned to summer, there wasn't really anything that grabbed the attention of the masses, with one exception. Stray was the indie hit of 2022. People were going nuts over this thing. A vast majority of gamers left glowing reviews, while a few were of the opinion that it's just okay. I sit squarely in the okay camp. I think Stray is far from a bad game. It's got incredible visuals and sound design, which act as the base for a beautiful world. but it doesn't really do much with that world. The story is super undercooked, and the more you play it, the more obvious it becomes just how many corners were cut in regards to this game's physics and animations. It was fun enough on the first playthrough, but I can't see myself replaying this game anytime soon. That was mostly it for year 2. Most major releases afterwards ranged from somewhat underwhelming to, yeah, no shit. And The Last of Us Part 1 gave me a good chuckle until I realized how many people were going crazy for this thing. I think society may be doomed. Once again, the time around this generation's anniversary was filled with major releases as developers attempted to get their titles published before news publications started their Game of the Year voting. The biggest release was God of War Ragnarok, sequel to what is arguably the best game on PS4, and it lived up to the hype. I have some mixed opinions on it and would probably consider Elden Ring to be my overall Game of the Year, but Ragnarok is still an outstanding title that stands toe-to-toe with its predecessor and deserves every ounce of praise it's received. Sonic Frontiers released the day before Ragnarok, and I've never really been a Sonic fan, so it probably doesn't count for much when I say that this never looked all that appealing in any of the trailers or gameplay demos prior to release. But now, having played it, It's at least better than I thought it was going to be, but that's all I'll say for now. We also got the Callisto Protocol, Need for Speed Unbound, and Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion in the remaining weeks of 2022, with Final Fantasy being the only one even remotely close to having consistently positive reviews. For once, 2023 offered a nice change of pace by actually having significant releases within its first few months. Dead Space, One Piece Odyssey, Atomic Heart, Octopath Traveler 2, and Forspoken, otherwise known as Bad Video Game. We also got ports of DBZ Kakarot, Monster Hunter Rise, and Like a Dragon Ishin, but the big release of early 2023 was Hogwarts Legacy, in more ways than one. Personally, as a longtime Harry Potter fan, I found a lot to love within Legacy, especially the fan service and attention to detail within the castle itself. However, looking at it critically, it's hard to deny this game's many shortcomings. Repetitive missions, stiff animations, poor writing, and a multitude of bugs. I think it's definitely more of a mixed bag than many of its review scores let on. March and April each had a few more titles of note, such as Dead Island 2, which released after spending 8 years in development hell, and it was just great to see this game finally come out. Star Wars Jedi Survivor also dropped, which I haven't played yet, though based on what I've read, it seems to mostly just be more of the first game. Same strengths, shortcomings, and all. Of course, the big one was the long-awaited Resident Evil 4 remake, and it really lived up to many fans' expectations. I think. There was a pretty vocal minority of purists who were opposed to the game, but by and large it received pretty positive reception, and from what I've seen, it looks like a pretty solid time. May ended up being a pretty nothing month. Company of Heroes 3 got mixed reviews, and both Redfall and Lord of the Rings Gollum flopped hard. You know you've messed up when even IGN gives you a 4 out of 10. June more than made up for it though. Street Fighter 6, Diablo 4, and Final Fantasy 16, all of which received very favorable reviews. The only one I have at this point is Final Fantasy, though I plan on checking out all 3 eventually. They all look really fun. August brought us Armored Core 6, the From Software game that made everyone my age go, wait, From Software actually makes other games? With its over-the-top action sequences and extensive customization, it looks like a good time, though I have heard it's pretty repetitive at its core. I'm looking forward to giving it a try, though I'll probably wait for it to go on sale before I pick it up. September was a huge month though. Cocoon, Lies of P, Payday 3, but bigger than all of that was the release of Starfield, Bethesda's most ambitious project ever. It was okay. Starfield seems like it has a pretty solid foundation for a space exploration game. I mean, the setting and art direction look fantastic, but both the story and exploration itself drew plenty of criticism. For many, Starfield didn't quite feel like the grand adventure it was promised to be. To be fair, after 8 years of development and who knows how many trailers and gameplay demos, Xbox had set some pretty high expectations going into release, and having Baldur's Gate 3 coming out the same day for PS5 probably didn't do it any favors. The hype for Baldur's Gate was unbelievable, and it was a huge success. The sheer scale of it alone damn near broke the internet. It's pretty high on my games to try list. Right now I'm just holding out hope that it'll get a physical release in North America. Rounding things out, October was another solid month for releases. Assassin's Creed Mirage seems decent enough, at least for a Ubisoft game. Forza Motorsport seems like a good bit of fun, and Alan Wake 2 seems to have surpassed the original, but the game I was most invested in was Spider-Man 2. I'm still making my way through it, so I'll save most of my thoughts for the end of year tier list, but for now I'll say that it's a very fun game, though I think I may prefer the original. And that is a quick overview of the 9th generation of home consoles from launch till now. Do you see what I'm talking about? Okay, it was a lot to process at once, so let's sharpen the focus. Of the PS5 games I currently own, we have a live service game with an infamous launch, a racing game, a port of a Gen 7 game, 3 ports of Gen 8 games, 4 sequels to Gen 8 games, 3 open world games of varying quality, a Switch-timed exclusive, some annual release garbage, Final Fantasy 16, and whatever the hell this is. Is that a bit reductive? Of course not, it's way reductive. But I think it says a lot that half of my physical library of PS5 games is taken up by ports of or sequels to Gen 8 titles. I don't mean to say that those sequels are bad games or anything, just their identities are pretty heavily dependent on that which came before, and I think that's the point I'm trying to make. We're almost halfway through this generation's life cycle, but so far, Gen 9 doesn't seem to have much of its own identity. If you think about it, almost every console generation has been defined more so by its games than the hardware itself. Some of those generation-defining games were launch titles for their systems, and some were released a bit later, but regardless of the generation, after 3 years, it's usually pretty apparent what those consoles are capable of, as well as what new styles of games are going to be popular. There's always a good few titles that set their generation apart from those prior. But Gen 9, it doesn't really have that. Almost all of Gen 9's biggest games are either sequels to last-gen titles, remasters of older games, or open-world games following in the footsteps of Breath of the Wild, which the main reason I didn't talk about the Switch is because, frankly, I have no clue what generation it belongs to yet, but regardless, that's a lot of games that derive a large part of their identity from titles released last decade. There's hardly any major hits that feel like they can't be run on last-gen hardware, or like they break from last-gen design trends. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but just look at the Xbox One and PS4. Even though their biggest games were yet to come, by their 3rd anniversary, we already had Battlefield 1, Bloodborne, Uncharted 4, Metal Gear Solid 5, Forza Horizon 3, and The Last of Us Remastered, with Nier and Final Fantasy 15 just around the corner. Most of these titles are sequels, sure, but they all brought massive changes to their franchises and were a big step forward for each respective series, with most of those now being considered one of, if not their series' best entry. It was already shaping up to be a generation of grand action-adventure / open-world games with an emphasis on story. They were games the likes of which we hadn't really seen before, and the further back in time you go, the more obvious the shift in identities between each generation becomes. Meanwhile, Gen 9 has Elden Ring, God of War Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Baldur's Gate 3, and Final Fantasy 16, and is shaping up to be a generation of grand action-adventure / open-world games with an emphasis on story. Again, as time has progressed, the graphical and technical improvements from one generation to the next have become more and more subtle, so it does make sense for newer titles to feel like they can be run on older hardware. But that doesn't really explain this. Again, I'm not saying that these are bad games, that this generation has no original titles, but when you combine this with games that are released in increasingly incomplete states, non-stop ports of older titles, and remasters that are little more than poorly disguised cash grabs, it all adds up to create a generation with a conflicted identity that feels like it's struggling to find ways to set itself apart from the past. And it's giving me the distinct impression that many companies are trying to see just how lazy they can get away with being. To me, what Gen 9 represents right now is a turning point within the game industry. It's always been a business dependent on the balance of sales and innovation, but given the past few years, I can see a few indicators that the scale has tipped a bit too far in one direction. And based on this year's Baldur's Gate discourse, I don't think I'm the only one to notice it either. While I don't agree with everything that was said, I do think that this conversation showed that many are concerned for the future of gaming. It's easy to point fingers and try to figure out one person or group to blame for this trend, but that alone isn't going to change anything. The reason games are being released like this is because a majority of the time, it works. It's profitable. People buy these games regardless of whether it's a cheap cash grab or riddled with microtransactions or in an outright incomplete state at launch. Money talks, and right now it's not deterring many companies from going down this path. You can't just rage to your friends or vent your frustrations online to your tens of followers. These corporations, they don't give a shit about that. Or you. To me, the obvious things to do may be the only things we can do. For one, you have to vote with your money. If you don't like cheap cash grabs, if you don't like microtransactions and season passes, if you don't like games that are incomplete at launch just to be fixed later through free updates, you cannot, I repeat, cannot support these practices under any circumstances. Like MLK said, a microtransaction anywhere is a threat to gamers everywhere. And more importantly, educate yourself. Start asking the truly big questions. How do you make a video game? What's the process really like? How are games financed? How do you pay people for making a game before you've made the game? Why are these practices as effective as they are? What's the psychology behind the advertising we're continuously exposed to? And what do I really want out of the games I play? Why do I derive enjoyment from this medium? It's only by knowing the answers to those questions, as well as the countless others we fail to ask ourselves, that I think we as individuals will be able to learn self-control, to see past the curtain that these companies have put up and figure out what exactly the games we play mean to us. If that seems like a lot to you, I get it. I struggle with it too. I'm not saying it's easy. It's just what it takes. Growth is a process. It never happens instantly. This lack of an identity that I've been feeling lately is the result of a change in the gaming industry, and if we want to manipulate the market so that it benefits us, then we as consumers have to grow too. I would love just as much as anyone to see us take back the future of gaming. To see that happen would be incredible. An industry reclaimed from the clutches of corporate interests, a win for us common folk. It'd be a societal achievement by any measure, an accomplishment created by wise minds, unwavering values, and a common love for one hobby. Then again, these are gamers we're talking about, so